What you just watched at the United Nations wasn't diplomacy, it was a warning shot dressed in a suit. On February 28, 2026, in a rare and explosive exchange, the US and Iranian ambassadors traded direct warnings and sharp rebuffs at an Emergency Security Council session. While nearly 900 US and Israeli strikes were still hitting Iran in just the first 12 hours of what Washington called Operation Epic Fury. This wasn't a debate. This was empire announcing itself in real time. The UN Secretary General stood before the Council and said plainly that diplomacy had been squandered, that talks were actively underway, preparations for Vienna negotiations were in motion, and the bombs fell anyway. Think about what that means. 3 rounds of indirect negotiations, mediated by Oman, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, all working the phones. And according to the White House itself, Iran rejected a final offer of a civilian nuclear program with American investment in exchange for full dismantlement. Whether you believe that framing or not, the result is the same. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is dead. More than 2,000 people are dead across Iran, Lebanon, and Israel. Hundreds of thousands are displaced. Now, here is the question no mainstream outlet is asking you to sit with. Iran's delegate at the UN called it a manifest injustice, the main victim of clear aggression, while the United States, as Council President for March, sat at the head of the table. The judge, the prosecutor, the attacker, all the same country, in the same chair. That is not a glitch in the system. That is the system. And when Russia and China abstained from a resolution condemning Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf neighbors, the Council adopted it 13-0, with 2 abstentions. The fracture lines of a new world order were drawn right there in that chamber for everyone to see. Today, Iran, the title says it. Tomorrow, who decides? On the morning of February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, a large-scale joint air campaign targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure, ballistic missile stockpiles, naval assets, and the leadership structure of the Iranian state itself. Within 48 hours, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was dead. His defense minister, his army chief of staff, and his IRGC commander-in-chief were all killed together in a single strike on a Defense Council meeting. The Supreme National Security Council headquarters was destroyed, and roughly 2,000 strikes were conducted across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces in just the first 2 days. 2,000 in 48 hours. Let that sit with you for a moment. Now, the United States government's official position is that this was necessary, that Iran was a threat, that its nuclear program had to be dismantled, that its ballistic missiles had to be eliminated, that 47 years of Iranian behavior, supporting proxies, threatening neighbors, chanting death to America, finally required a military answer. And for millions of Americans, that argument lands. But here is what the argument does not tell you. Just the day before the bombs started falling, on February 27, 2026, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi announced that a breakthrough had been reached in negotiations. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium, agreed to full verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and had agreed to irreversibly downgrade its existing enriched uranium to the lowest level possible. Al-Busaidi said peace was within reach. Within reach, 1 day before the first bombs hit Tehran. So you have to ask yourself, and this is not a partisan question, this is not a Republican or Democratic question, this is a basic question of logic and historical honesty. If peace was within reach on February 27th, why were bombs falling on February 28th? And the answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about what is actually happening right now in the world, what the title of this video really means, and why it matters not just for Iran, not just for the Middle East, but for every country on earth that is watching what the United States does and drawing their own conclusions. The United States has said that it was acting in line with the right to self-defense under the UN Charter. It accused Iran of continuing to advance its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. But the attacks also followed the failure of indirect negotiations in February, and even the mediating Omani foreign minister had stated that significant progress was being made, with Iran willing to make concessions. President Trump said he was not thrilled with the talks, not thrilled. The entire machinery of international diplomacy, Oman, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, all working the phones, and the President of the United States was not thrilled. And so the bombs fell. Now, I want you to think about what this looks like from every capital outside of Washington and Tel Aviv, because that is where the story of Tomorrow Others begins. International legal scholars have widely considered the 2026 US-Israel attacks on Iran to be illegal under international law, arguing that they violate the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force, do not meet the criteria for self-defense, and lack authorization from the UN Security Council under Chapter 7. Ben Saul, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, stated that Iran had not enriched uranium to the point of building a nuclear device, that experts agreed Iran did not possess a nuclear weapon, and that the case was nowhere close to being self-defense against an imminent attack. Nowhere close. That is not a fringe opinion. That is the United Nations' own appointed expert saying on the record that the legal argument does not hold. As legal scholars explained in Just Security, the US military attack on Iran represents a textbook example of a manifest violation of Article 2 or 4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The challenge facing the United Nations is not about the interpretation of international law. The challenge is a political, economic, and fundamentally ethical one. And that ethical question is exactly what was on the table at the United Nations Security Council on March 11, 2026, when delegations gathered to vote. And what happened in that room was one of the most revealing moments in the history of that institution. The 15-member council adopted Resolution 2817, condemning Iran's attacks against Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan by a vote of 13 in favor, with 2 abstentions from China and Russia. The resolution condemned Iran's attacks against residential areas and civilian objects and demanded their immediate cessation. It demanded that Tehran halt its threats and actions aimed at interfering with maritime trade. The resolution said nothing about the United States, nothing about Israel, nothing about the bombing that started the entire war. It pointed one finger at Iran and Iran alone. Iranian Ambassador Amir Said Iravani called it a blatant misuse of the Security Council mandate in pursuit of the political agendas of the United States and Israel. He told the Council directly, "This resolution is a manifest injustice against my country, the main victim of a clear act of aggression." And here is what the United States Ambassador Mike Waltz said in response. He insisted that Operation Epic Fury was directed towards specific and strategic objectives, such as dismantling Iran's missile capabilities. He said Iran's support for terrorist organizations like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas had brought bloodshed across the Middle East, and he quoted President Trump's words to the Iranian people, saying their freedom was at hand. Freedom at hand. Delivered by 2,000 airstrikes in 48 hours, while diplomacy was one day away from a breakthrough. This is the language of empire, dressed in the language of liberation. And it is not the first time in American history that we have heard these words. We heard them in Iraq, we heard them in Libya, and now we are hearing them again in Iran. But this time, something is different. What Operation Epic Fury has revealed is something harder to manage and more corrosive to American influence abroad. The United States has become an unpredictable offshore force, no longer committed to an international liberal order, but still powerful enough to reshape the region in a matter of days. That analysis comes not from a radical publication, not from an anti American source, but from a research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the most establishment foreign policy institutions in the United States. When the Council on Foreign Relations is telling you that America has become an unpredictable force, no longer committed to the international order it built, you are not listening to a protest. You are listening to the American foreign policy establishment itself sounding the alarm. Now let's talk about what happens on the ground, because the consequences of this war are not staying contained. Beginning on March 4th, 2026, Iranian forces declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit the waterway. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre reported 10 attacks on ships as of March 8th. 5 crew members on 2 vessels had been killed. Ship traffic through the strait dropped dramatically. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow channel between Iran and Oman, roughly 27% of the world's maritime trade in crude oil and petroleum products transits through this waterway, not 5%, not 10%. More than a quarter of the world's oil moves through that choke point, and it is now effectively closed. Qatar Energy warned that it can no longer guarantee deliveries of liquefied natural gas to customers after an Iranian drone attacked the world's largest LNG facility. Customers were already scrambling for alternative supplies. Think about what that sentence actually means for ordinary people in this country. When Qatar cannot guarantee LNG deliveries, that is not an abstraction. That travels through supply chains and shows up in energy bills, in manufacturing costs, in the price of plastics, in the price of fertilizer, and eventually in the price of food. Roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits the Strait of Hormuz. Urea prices at the New Orleans fertilizer hub have already risen sharply, and experts warned this timing could not be worse, coming right at the spring planting window in the Midwest for soy and corn. And the car you drive. About 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East go through this route. Shortages and backlogs will raise the price of packaging, automotive components, and consumer goods. So if you are sitting at home right now in Ohio, in Georgia, in Texas, in California, and you are wondering why gas prices are surging, why grocery costs are climbing, why your heating bill looks different, the answer has a name: Operation Epic Fury. The war that most Americans, according to poll after poll, never asked for. A majority of Americans, 56%, oppose or strongly oppose US military action in Iran, according to the Marist poll. Most Democrats and more than 6 in 10 independents expressed opposition. And the Quinnipiac University poll found that 74% of voters oppose sending ground troops into Iran. 74%. Yet Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has said the United States military is just getting started. And the White House press secretary, when asked directly whether ground troops could be deployed, declined to rule it out. This is where we have to talk about what happened inside the United States government, because the story of democracy in America during this war is itself a crisis. The war powers resolution to block President Trump from ordering further strikes on Iran failed to advance in the Senate, declining to halt a war that Trump started without the consent of Congress. The war powers resolution was the 8th on which Congress had voted since June. All of them have failed. The 8th, not the 1st, not the 2nd. The 8th time that Congress tried to assert its constitutional authority over war making, and the 8th time that it failed. The Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress the power to declare war. Trump did not seek congressional approval before ordering the strikes on Tehran. And the Republican-controlled Congress with a handful of bipartisan exceptions, voted to let him keep going. The tally in the House, 212 to 219, provided a clarifying snapshot of political support for and opposition to the US-Israel military operation and Trump's rationale for bypassing Congress, which alone has the power to declare war. 212 members of the House voted to assert Congress's constitutional authority. 219 voted to let one man decide whether America goes to war. This is the internal architecture of the new American political order. And this matters far beyond America's borders, because every government watching this, every country that is aligned with the United States, every country that depends on American commitment to rules and institutions, is drawing the same conclusion. The rules apply when they're convenient, and they don't apply when they're not. Canada and Australia both issued statements supporting the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Canada's statement was described as an embarrassing about-face following its Prime Minister's Davos speech proclaiming a principled foreign policy. An embarrassing about-face. These are nations that have spent decades insisting that international law is the foundation of the global order. And when the United States violated that law in the most explicit way possible, they fell in line. Not because they believe it was right, because they believe they cannot afford to say otherwise. In a world where American power can impose tariffs, seize territory, and threaten allies for non-compliance, as this administration has done, the rules-based order is no longer a set of rules. It is a performance. It is a costume worn when convenient and discarded when not. Now, here is what the new Iranian supreme leader is saying. And this matters because it tells you that the stated objective of the war, which was regime change, has not been achieved. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated supreme leader, issued his first statement as Iran's new leader, calling for national unity and vowing that the vital global artery of the Strait of Hormuz would continue to be closed to pressure Iran's enemies. He also called for all US bases in the region to be immediately closed, saying those countries must have understood by now that the American claim of establishing security and peace was nothing but a lie. The man that Trump called a lightweight and said was unacceptable to him is now the supreme leader of Iran, and his first words to the world are a direct confrontation with the United States, not a capitulation, not a Venezuela-style accommodation, a confrontation. Mojtaba's selection carries powerful symbolic weight inside Iran. His father, mother, sister, wife, daughter, and young niece were reportedly killed during the US and Israeli strikes. The regime can frame him as a symbol of Iran's sacrifice, a rallying cry in a country where the concept of martyrdom holds immense ideological and political significance. Trump wanted to install a compliant successor the same way the administration believes it replaced the leadership in Venezuela. What he got instead is a supreme leader whose entire family was killed by American bombs, whose first public message is of our vengeance, and who represents, to a large portion of the Iranian population, not a figure of compromise, but a figure of national martyrdom. Day 13 of Operation Epic Fury, no ceasefire, no surrender, no off-ramp visible, the diplomatic path that ended the shorter 2025 conflict, Omani mediation, a defined scope of targets, room for negotiation, has been foreclosed by the assassination that started this one. The off-ramp is gone. The negotiating table was abandoned by Washington before the bombs fell. And now, with 3.2 million Iranians displaced, over 1,300 people killed in Iran, nearly 700 in Lebanon, and the humanitarian situation described by the United Nations Refugee Agency as rising and likely to worsen significantly, there is no easy exit. And the new Iranian supreme leader has made clear he has no intention of providing one. Here is the larger picture, and this is the picture that the title of this video is really about. Political scientists and security experts warned that this military operation elevates the risk that the United States will be less able to manage other global threats: Russia's territorial ambitions in Ukraine and Europe, China's expansionist aspirations in Asia, and the ongoing danger posed by a nuclear-armed North Korea. This is a simple matter of logistics, noted one expert. As big and powerful as the US military is, it does not have bottomless capability to offset losses associated with major military operations and the possibility of an extended war in the Middle East, while also providing weapons to Ukraine and Europe. Each missile launched and every air defense system deployed further depletes an already stretched arsenal. Read that again. Every missile fired at Iran is a missile not available for the defense of Ukraine. Every air defense system deployed in the Gulf is an air defense system not positioned in Europe. The military resources of the United States are not infinite. And the idea that you can fight a large-scale war in the Middle East, maintain pressure on Russia, manage tensions in the South China Sea, and somehow keep the entire architecture of American global power intact is not a strategy. It is an illusion. By a 51% to 29% margin, American registered voters in a Fox News poll said that Trump's handling of relations with Iran has made the United States less safe, not more safe, not less popular, less safe. The American people are seeing this in real time, and they are drawing a conclusion that the polls are now showing clearly and repeatedly, and yet the machine keeps moving. Secretary Rubio said the attacks would increase in intensity. Defense Secretary Hegseth said they were just getting started. Economist Jeffrey Sachs, speaking to Democracy Now!, described the conflict as a war of choice with no humane, moral, or legal justification, and warned it could lead toward a wider war if the trajectory continues. And the United Nations Security Council, in response, passed a resolution condemning Iran for its attacks on US allies, while ignoring the role of the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government in instigating the bloodshed. That is the institution that was created after World War II, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral military aggression from reshaping the world by force. And today, it cannot even pass a resolution that mentions the country that started the war. So when you hear the phrase, today Iran, tomorrow others, understand that this is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition. This is what the rest of the world is doing right now in real time. Every government on earth, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe, is watching what happened to Iran and asking themselves, what do we need to do to make sure this does not happen to us? And the answer that many of them are arriving at is not to trust the United States more. It is to trust it less, to build alternative alliances, to explore different economic arrangements, to reconsider where they hold their reserves, who they trade with, which military pacts they maintain. The conflict is materially improving Russia's competitive position in crude oil markets. With Middle East barrels facing logistical disruption, both India and China face strong incentives to deepen their reliance on Russian supply. The war that was sold as making America stronger is, in the architecture of global trade and energy, making Russia richer. And China is watching every moment of it, studying how the world reacts and calibrating its own future calculations. This is not the world order anymore. This is the world disorder. And the United Nations Security Council chamber, where America sat as judge and president while condemning only the country it had bombed into retaliation, that chamber is not a place of international law right now. It is a stage. And what is being performed on that stage tells every nation watching exactly what the rules of this new era actually are. The rules are simple, power writes them, and the question of tomorrow others is not whether it will happen. It is only a question of sequence, timing, and who has the power to resist.